We are the salt of the earth, so give ear to us. No new ideas shall ever come near to us. Orthodox, Catholic, crammed with divinity, damn the dissenters, hurrah for old Trinity. I arrived in Canada in December 1939, just after the outbreak of war. My parents had been here before, and they had inquired about the possibility of my attending university. But they were told at Trinity College, which was the only secular college at the University of Toronto, they were told that it was too late. I had missed a whole term and I would have to wait until the following September to start again. That was bad news, but fortunately my mother had met a woman, a Mrs. Walker, who was quite influential. She knew the Dean of Women at St. Hilda's College, Mrs. Kirkwood. Mrs. Kirkwood invited us for tea. She also invited the head of the French department. We munched cucumber sandwiches, and Professor Hicks asked me a few questions in French, which I answered, and I was informed that I could start as a student at Trinity College the following week. One of my courses in English was Canadian and American literature. At that point, the only American novel I had read was Gone with the Wind, and I hadn't read any Canadian. Of course, in Czechoslovakia, we didn't know there was such a thing as Canadian literature. My professor, Arthur Barker, took me under his wing and coached me free of charge for the remainder of that term. And as a result, I managed to pass the examination in Canadian and American literature without any difficulty. And coincidentally, the examination the following day was an examination in Shakespeare. We had studied Hamlet that year, and I had written an essay about the issue of delay in Hamlet. So I looked up past examination questions, and I found that invariably people were asked either the question of delay or Hamlet's madness. So I figured that I had a 50% chance of doing well because I knew about delay. But when the question came the day of the examination, the main question was discuss the issue of procrastination in Hamlet. Now, procrastination was a word that I was not familiar with. I figured that it sounded like some sort of madness. So I wrote an essay about how Hamlet's madness somehow led to his delaying his decisions. And amazingly enough, I got away with it and I passed. In the course of my sessions with Professor Barker, he at one point explained to me the reason for the different colleges at the university. He told me that in the history of human knowledge. Knowledge was either secular, which was the philosophy that University College was based on, or knowledge was spiritual, which was the why Trinity College required us to study religious knowledge as undergraduates at that college. And so he said, that is why you have to study religious knowledge. And then with a twinkle in his eye, he said, unless there happens to be a war on, in which case you can take military studies instead. One of my professors in my second year at university was Northrop Frye. He was not as famous as he later became, but he was already considered an outstanding lecturer. And his subject that year was Elizabethan literature. And I'll never forget his first lecture. He said, in a bit of a nasal voice, he said, Queen Elizabeth, as you know, was the Virgin Queen, and the great success as a queen, at which point we all collapsed in giggles, because this was an enormously risque comment to make, that the Queen was a success as a queen, but evidently not as a virgin. My parents had no difficulty making new friends in Toronto. One of my father's good friends was a man called Jim Bennett. Bennett was originally English, or had settled in Canada. He had 4 children, two sons and 2 daughters. His sons had joined the Canadian Armed Forces. They owned a horse because Jim was very much a horsey person, and so that horse was not being ridden, and Jim offered it to me. I was overjoyed, of course. My father was very doubtful about the whole thing, but I insisted, and so Clay Pipe, that was the name of the horse, became mine. We stabled him at a stables that at that time was at the head of what is now the Rosedale Valley Road. And every morning I got up and I drove to the stables. I rode Clay Pipe up and down the Rosedale Valley Road. And after that I went home and changed, and I went to my classes at university. After a few months, I decided that I just couldn't keep it up, particularly with exams coming up. It was just too much. So I told my father that we'd have to return the horse. So he told Jim Bennett that we have to return the horse because I couldn't keep on riding and attending lectures at the same time. And Jim Bennett looked at Father in amazement, and he said, if she can't do both, why doesn't she give up university? In my second year at Trinity, Dorothea Wedd arrived, and she and I became instant friends. Dorothea, it turned out, had spent the last few years of her life in France, where her father was head of Massey Ferguson in Europe. So she had gone to school in Lille and had, I believe, graduated with her baccalaureate. Her French was absolutely perfect. But apart from that, of course, she understood what the situation was in Europe. The Germans had invaded France, and it looked as though they were going to control all of Europe, which is something she and I understood, but most of our Canadian schoolmates did not. So we had that very much in common, and she and I became lifelong friends. That time at Trinity, we attended French classes where our professor was Bill Rogers, and Bill told us years ago that it was a traumatic experience for him because while his French was pretty good, it did not compare to that of Dorothea, or for that matter mine, because I had gone to a French school for many years and my French was very good at that time too. Within a week or two after I started at university, I was asked by a classmate, Adine Seagram, was I going to the Saints Formal. The Saints Formal, it turned out, was an annual dance that was hosted by St. Hilda's College. I said no, I couldn't go because I didn't know any boys that I could invite. And Adine said, oh, no problem, I'll get you a blind date. And I said, a blind date? What on earth is that? Well, she explained it to me, and it sounded interesting, and I said, sure. So I came home, and I told my parents that I was going to a dance, and I was going on a blind date. And they said, what's a blind date? I explained it to them the way Adine had explained it to me, and they seemed a bit doubtful about it. But after a while they decided if that was the custom in this country, they might as well go along with it. So I went to the Saints Formal with my blind date, which was a man called Henry Hussey, and Adine and her date. So we were a foursome, and we had a good time. As it turned out, Adine, many years later, married Henry Hussey, who had been my date. But by then, I had graduated, and I was a long way away. I got invited to many parties after I joined Trinity, and I remember one party in particular when I met a handsome young man who was in a Scottish uniform. He had joined one of the Scottish regiments, and he invited me out. So I came home, I informed my parents that I was going out with this young man, and they said, what do you know about him? And I said, I don't know anything about him other than that he's a lieutenant in this government, in this regiment. And my mother said, oh dear, my daughter's going out with a soldier, just like our cook back home. I did go out with him, and we were joined by another couple. The four of us went to see the Mikado, and after it was over, we went to have a cup of coffee, and then this young man took me home. And as we arrived at our house, my father stood at the door, and he looked daggers, and he said, where have you been? I can only assume that he had checked to see that the Mikado was over, and he figured I had been somewhere after that, and he wanted to know where. Anyway, the young man was obviously turned off by my father, and I'm sorry to say I never saw him again. During my time at Trinity, I wrote a couple of articles for the Trinity Review, which was the college magazine. The articles were published, and on the basis of that, I guess I was invited to join the board of the review, and eventually I became the assistant editor. The editor was a young man called Arthur Gibson, and at one time in my last year, no, my third year I think it must have been, he took me aside and he started talking about his past, about some terrible things, and I didn't know what he was talking about. I said to him, well, I guess we have all done things at one time or another which we are not proud of. And he said, no, but in my case, I could be jailed for what I didn't know it. Well, of course, as I eventually realized, he was trying to tell me that he was a homosexual. Eventually, he suffered a nervous breakdown, and I was appointed editor in his stead. Arthur himself recovered, he converted to Catholicism, and the last I heard of him, he was a professor at the Roman Catholic St. Michael's College.